Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 19. Island Life. The cell door opened suddenly that morning. A screw stood in the doorway. "Dalgleish? That's me. Get your stuff, lad. You're coming with me. You're off to the seaside." Martin thought it was some kind of joke. "Come on, son, make it snappy. I ain't got all day." "What's this about?" "You're being moved to an open prison, mate." Martin couldn't believe his ears. He'd prayed he might be moved. They'd told him he'd probably have to stay in the scrubs for the duration. Trevor congratulated him. "You jammy bastard! Bloody holiday camp." Ronnie enlightened him. "Open prison. Fresh air and sunshine, mate." "Okay. See you then, I guess. Thanks for everything." Martin shook hands with Ronnie and Trevor. They'd saved his life. The screw hurried him along. He bundled his toothbrush, spare shirt and a couple of tattered music magazines in his prison jacket and followed the screw downstairs. He took him along the hallway to the reception area where he'd first arrived. The screw on duty rubber-stamped the procedure. Outside, just inside the prison entrance, a prison service transit was waiting with a few other lucky inmates on board. Martin turned to the prisoner behind him. "Where we going, mate?" "Isle of Sheppey, down in Kent, my son. Nothing there except sheep." "What's it like?" "Better than this shithole, I can tell you. No bleeding walls around it, just fields and marshes. Bloody paradise." The screw slammed the back doors shut. The minibus drove out through the red, brown and white portcullis-style entrance archway. At the end of the driveway, the drab Victorian prison had elaborate black and gold painted wrought iron gates. Martin wasn't free, but he was so glad to be out of that cell. Just to be able to look out onto the streets was sensational. They drove east along the Westway for a couple of miles, then headed south through Kensington. They skirted Hyde Park and crossed the Thames over Lambeth Bridge. Martin stared out of the window as the minibus drove through the scruffy suburbs of southeast London and then the green of the Kent countryside. They crossed the bridge onto the Isle of Sheppey. The landscape opened out into expansive grass flatlands. Here and there it was dotted with sheep in huge fields bordered by sparse hedges and few trees. It reminded Martin of the reclaimed marshland along the coast from his hometown. The fields became gently undulating as they drove inland. Some of them were planted with bright yellow rapeseed, just like the mustard fields that Martin used to see on the South Downs. They turned off the main road and drove south to the open prison. It was a cluster of about 10 long huts and several larger buildings surrounded by farmland and marshes. There was just a 5-foot wire mesh and a wooden paling fence around the perimeter. Martin thought it resembled a prisoner of war camp, or even a wartime airfield, like in all those war films he'd seen as a kid. It had indeed been an RAF camp. The huts were pre-war vintage, but you wouldn't need a tunnel to escape. At reception, they registered Martin's arrival and put the labelled plastic bag with his valuables in a cubbyhole. He was told he was in Hut 7. A screw took him and the other new arrivals along the network of paths to their respective huts. Martin went into his and saw there were 6 beds down each side. There was a separate single room on the left next to the entrance door. Opposite was the toilet, a real one where you could close the door. Martin's bed was the last one on the right. It had a bedside cupboard for clothes and shoes. There were 6 windows on each side of the hut, each about 3 foot square. The hut seemed light and airy. So much space after that 12 foot by 7 foot cell. Life had changed almost beyond recognition overnight. They were just in time for lunch. One of the large buildings housed the kitchen and the canteen. It actually smelt quite good, like school dinners on a good day. There was a large counter where you lined up for food with your tray. Here they actually had plates. It was shepherd's pie with peas and gravy, chocolate sponge and custard for dessert. You could get as many cups of tea as you liked. They even had proper milk. Martin got his food and sat down at one of the long trestle tables. No going back to your miserable cell. It was really good and the portions were generous. The food was cooked and served by inmates. They knew it had to be good. After lunch was roll call. Then Martin was taken to the factory. This was the other large building on the complex. Inside were rows of workbenches where about 60 inmates were busy assembling and soldering desk lamps. Martin knew how to use a soldering iron. It was a very simple, repetitive task. The radio was tuned to pop and turned up quite loud. The time drifted by until they finished around 4. Back in the hut, Martin lay on his bed smoking a roll-up and reading a well-worn Music Weekly. The guy in the bed opposite was a thick-set young cockney called Eddie. He liked to be well informed. "So, what's the story then, Martin? Eh? What you in for?" "Oh, blimey. Drugs, mate. Too many of them." "Caught bang to rights then?" "You could say that. 50 tabs of acid on me, bit of speed, bit of weed. SPG pounced on me in the West End." "Bloody Nora, that was bad luck. What was you doing up west then? Up to no good, I'll bet." "That's what they thought, but I wasn't. I was going to dump the tabs on a mate, sick of the sight of them." "I believe you. Old Bill never swallow it though." "What they give you?" 6 months. "That all? You was well lucky, my son." "What about you?" "Thieving motors. Got nabbed once too often. Was on bail, got nicked again. Swiped a jag. Stopped for speeding in Piccadilly. Did a runner, but they find me hiding in the park. Give me 3 years. "Bloody hell. How long you got left?" "Done a year, another 6 months I might get out on parole." Eddie was cool. He was a classic cheeky chappie. He also looked as if he'd be handy in a fight. Martin was glad. A good neighbour. Pat was the hut leader. He got the separate single room. He was meant to keep an eye on things and make sure no one stepped out of line. Martin got on well with him. They got talking when he spotted Martin's copy of Lord of the Rings. He read books too. With his neatly cut hair and ironed shirt, Pat could have sat behind a manager's desk. He was doing 4 years for handling stolen goods in impressively large quantities. In the hut, he commanded authority without any fuss. A long, hard look sufficed. One evening, he invited Martin into his private kingdom and shut the door. He fished out a joint from between the neatly folded bedclothes. After a couple of hits, he passed it to Martin. The hash was good. Best Pakistani black, mate. Martin could taste the truth. They chatted away until after curfew. Just as Martin was about to leave, Pat made a proposition. "Listen, mate, I bet you wouldn't mind having a smoke every night. Am I right?" "Sounds good. What's the catch?" "No catch. You just have to run a couple of errands. You get a smoke in return." Martin was curious. What kind of errands? "Look, I got this civvy bloke. He brings it in every 2 or 3 weeks, gives it to one of the trainee cons in a toolbox. He brings it to me. I've got 10 or 12 regular customers. People only want quid deals. They pay in tobacco or sometimes cash. You just deliver a couple an evening. Collect the snout or the dosh and you're sweet. Don't whisper it to a soul and you'll be fine. Martin decided the risk was minimal. The reward was considerable. "OK, Pat, I'll give it a go." Pat slipped him a minuscule worm of Pakistani as a gesture of goodwill. It was enough to load Martin's good-night cigarette. He had the best night's sleep he'd had for a couple of months. Chris was a crook, like everyone else at the prison. Like them, he'd been unlucky or stupid enough to get caught. Chris used to rob chemist shops. His MO was to break in at night. He'd climb through a window into the pharmacist's storeroom and bust open the dangerous drugs cabinet. He used to sell most of his booty, but also partook of it generously himself. The night he got caught, he'd fallen asleep under the counter. He was about Martin's age, a skinny little guy with a front tooth missing, resulting in a slight lisp. He talked non-stop like speed freaks do. He was doing 3 years, breaking and entering, theft of dangerous controlled substances with intent to supply. Chris played guitar and sang. He had a 12-string acoustic. Martin first stumbled across him when Chris was sitting outside his hut one day on a chair in the sunshine. He was singing Bread's "Make It With You." Martin latched onto the poignant Major 7th theme and sat down and listened. They got talking. Martin hoped to get his acoustic guitar on the next visit. Chris handed him the guitar for a try, and Martin played a few blues riffs. Chris was impressed. "We should do some songs together." "Yeah, and why not?" Chris lowered his voice and leant closer. "I should have a nice smoke for us this weekend." "Oh yeah?" "Yeah, the wife's coming on a visit. We're going to do the condom trick." Martin visualised some kind of conjugal activity. "So at home, she rolls a quarter of hash into a capsule shape and puts it in a condom. She puts it in her mouth just before the visit. We have a quick snog when she gets there. She passes it into my mouth and I swallow it. Just have to wait for Mother Nature. Then bingo." It sounded distinctly dodgy to Martin. He'd stick to small-scale drug running. Morning roll call was a bit like being in the army. It reminded Martin of the school cadet force, having to wear those awful itchy serge uniforms. The senior prison officer started calling the names on his list alphabetically. He read one out several times, but there was no reply. "Freeman? 64521? Absconded." Another screw with a clipboard duly noted the absence. A loud cheer went up. This happened at least once a week. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 on one day. All you needed to do was to get someone to pick you up in a car. You could slip out of a hut window at night between the patrols and walk to a pickup point. Legging it over the marshes was too risky. You'd probably sink in the quagmire. Chris's name was one of the last to be called. Martin looked along the rows of inmates and couldn't see him. Then he saw Chris coming from the huts with 2 other inmates. Chris was in the middle and walking rather strangely. In fact, his feet didn't seem to be touching the ground. His hutmate slipped in at the back, unnoticed. Chris was propped up between them, an inane grin on his face. His eyes were bloodshot and his head was slightly on one side. When they called his name, his mates prodded him violently. He cried out, "Ah!" The screw took this as a yes and marked him present. Martin went over to see if Chris was all right. His mate explained, "Bloody idiot, condom burst. He'll be out of it for days." Chris now had enough THC inside him to get an elephant stoned. He had a pretty tough constitution, but he'd have to be kept an eye on. His mates lay him on his bed and told the medical officer he'd eaten something that didn't agree with him. They let him off work that day, but for the next 2 or 3 he was on a higher plane than the rest of the camp. Alcohol was nigh on impossible to smuggle in on visits. It was occasionally available at an extortionate price if you had the right contacts. This engendered a spirit of enterprise. When one of the inmates working in the kitchen came up with the bright idea of pilfering spuds and brewing hooch. Where to hide and set up a still was the main problem. The roof cavity in the hut was big enough. The vessels needed could be adapted from the canteen kitchenware. A small camping gas ring was smuggled in to provide the requisite heat. Operation Pochine was a closely guarded secret. Martin had been totally unaware of it. For several weeks the bootleggers enjoyed the fruits of their labours discreetly after lights out. Apart from some loud discussions having to be shushed when the screws came round on patrol, all went well. One night there was a much louder commotion from the hooch hut. Martin saw the flashing of torches and heard raised voices. Several of the occupants had imbibed a little too much of their illicit wares. The effects of the lethal concoction had loosened tongues and inhibitions. This time animated discussion had led to fierce argument. Objects were thrown and punches flew. The screws on duty ran to the scene and broke up the fight at the prison speakeasy. They confiscated what booze they found and confined the pugilists to the punishment block cells. Then it all went quiet. 2 of the hut's occupants were relieved of their kitchen duties. The stolen kitchenware was returned to its proper station. From then on, stocks of potatoes, sugar and yeast were put under lock and key. Martin, and just about everyone else, found it hilarious. On the day after Sarah's visit, a screw walked into the hut carrying Martin's acoustic guitar in its soft case. Martin thanked him. He immediately took it out to check it was in one piece. They'd obviously had a look inside, but it looked fine. He tuned it up and played a couple of chords. Eddie thought it was brilliant. "Cool, a nice one. Give us a tune, Martin. What about Please Release Me?" "Very funny, Eddie. I could do some Pink Floyd." "Pink what? What the bloody hell's that?" "We're just 2 lost souls swimming in a fishbowl." Eddie was actually quite impressed. "I had some goldfish once. Forgot to feed 'em." Martin put the guitar away. He'd have to find somewhere to play in private. One evening down by the field he came across a hut that didn't seem to be in use. The door wasn't locked, so he took a look inside. It was set up as a classroom, with a blackboard at one end, a desk, a couple of dozen chairs lined up in rows. There was a timetable on the wall by the door. Nothing after 4 p.m. Perfect. Now Martin went down to the classroom with his guitar every evening. He worked on his new songs. After about a month he had 4 that he was pleased with. It took away the feeling of utter pointlessness in prison. A way to let out the sadness and frustration at being away from Sarah. Without his books and his guitar, he probably would have gone crazy. Sarah came to visit for the last time 2 weeks before his release date. He knew those last 14 days would be the slowest in his life. And Sarah came bearing news. It wasn't good. Sarah had some uncomfortable details to fill in. It's about Dave. He started picking me up at the flat so I could come to gigs. He was really nice, bought me drinks and took me home afterwards. I used to ask him in for coffee. It was all just friends at first. One night I'd had a bit too much to drink and I felt lonely. What are you saying, Sarah? You slept with Dave? In my fucking bed? It's worse than that, Martin. It's got quite serious for a couple of weeks. Dave stayed over most nights. I realised it was all wrong and I put a stop to it just in time. It was only 2 weeks, Martin. Dave hasn't called or been round since then. It's finished. And that's supposed to make me feel better? Fucking hell, Sarah. How could you? I'm sorry, truly sorry, Martin, but it's too late. It happened. So shit happens. I'm supposed to forgive you, is that it? Martin was crying. Sarah held both his hands on the table. Time was up. She had to go. They kissed and Sarah walked away. She turned before she went out of the door. Martin smiled and waved. Inside, part of him was seething.